Hodson.
It falls to me to make the final contribution for Labor and perhaps to make some observations about the last 3 days of debate. And perhaps a starting point is to remind ourselves that the standing orders around this debate have changed in recent times. It used to be that Parliament began every year by the Prime Minister of the day reading out a statement, a prime ministerial statement, in sort of prime ministerial ease, verbatim. It was sort of vaguely interesting, but it does not have any theatre to it, and the Leader of the Opposition of the day could then get up as he or she saw fit and, make a great speech with lots of theatre or drama or feeling or passion or something, and the second speech was always better than the first. And then the rules changed. And the rules changed in such a way that although the Prime Minister had to put together a prime ministerial speech which was widely distributed prior and embargoed against delivery, in the House the Prime Minister could do what he or she liked. And as a result, because the Prime Minister of the day is a part of the government and therefore had the agenda, one might expect the first speaker to win. Well, that didn't happen. 3 days ago, Phil Goff beat John Key on every point. He had better delivery, he had better content, he believed in what he said, and he said it with an authority that Mr Key was not able to muster. Mr Key, I think, is starting to work out that smile and wave by itself won't do it anymore. It's no longer enough, nor is mincing for that matter. It's getting more serious than that. The cost of living really is going up. It's not just that the Labor Party says it is, it's now provably going up. Unemployment went up surprisingly just a little while ago, a few days ago. It had the Prime Minister rushing around and saying that the unemployment stats are pretty unstable and starting to sound like Roger Douglas in the 1980s, actually, when interest rates went up, and Roger Douglas said that they were trending downwards around they were volatile around a downward trend, and so we've got unemployment volatile around a downward trend, actually going up. So that's not working well for Mr Key, and it perhaps reflected on his performance. A double-dip recession is now on the cards, says his Minister of Finance this week, the same week that he reminded us that Australia might be having a double-dip recession when in fact they haven't even had one. So none of the plans that Mr Key has put in place for the last couple of years have worked. And it seems to me that that might have reflected on why his speech was so lacklustre. The plan to dig up the conservation estate didn't work. The 13-day working week didn't work. The bike track, or whatever it was, didn't work. Waiting and hoping didn't work. Restructuring the public sector won't work. Cutting the public sector won't work. In fact, it'll drive the recession harder. Cutting early childhood education has gone down extremely badly for the Prime Minister. Flying the kite of asset sales hasn't gone very well for the Prime Minister and is about to go much more seriously pear-shaped for the Prime Minister as the debate continues and as the information progressively makes itself into the public arena. And all the while that that's happening, the Maori Party's been fracturing this week, just like the ACT Party fractured last year. And so that's probably why Mr Key's speech wasn't very good 3 days ago. No wonder he fell back on the sort of okie-dokie, blokey-jokey stuff. No wonder he moved the earth for precisely no one. And no wonder did he fail. No wonder is it that he failed to give any sense that he had any idea of what a plan for recovery might look like. And so that set the tone, actually. The rest of the National Party then decided that they could do graceless behaviour as well. I should acknowledge that many of them said Happy New Year, and today, even this afternoon, one of them said so in Chinese, which was lovely. And it was nice to see the National Party not being graceless about some of the changes and the promotions that some of my colleagues have had earlier this week in their own portfolios, etc. So I don't want to say that they were entirely graceless, but they were mostly so. Mostly saying things about the previous Labor government which are straightforwardly wrong. There were 9 budget surpluses in 9 years under that government. The public debt was paid down to the point where it didn't exist under that government. Unemployment came down to the point where it was the lowest in the world. Actually, not quite. Sometimes South Korea beat us, and sometimes we beat them. But sort of lowest or second lowest in the world, if ever a country was going to have some sort of global recession effect, boy, was that the starting point, the place to start. And none of that's been acknowledged. None of that's been acknowledged by the National Party in the last 3 days. No, it hasn't been acknowledged that right through that period they only had one idea, which was that they wanted us to cut taxes. They wanted us to cut taxes when the economy was growing quickly, which of course would be wildly inflationary. That was the only thing that they wanted us to do when we were in government. And they have not acknowledged that we delayed tax cuts until 2008, and so that we could pay down the debt, so that we could get KiwiSaver started, so that we could get the New Zealand Superannuation Fund underway, so that we could implement, embed working for families and significantly address child poverty. Some would say not significantly enough, but to make that progress. And actually, while we're at it, to buy back a couple of things this country needs, an airline and a railroad, which in the hands of the private sector had fallen into disrepair and were going down the tubes. That's what we did instead of cutting taxes. And then in 2008, when the global economy was going down and when everyone was a Keynesian, we put in tax cuts. And those tax cuts did not alter the rich-poor gap in this country one iota, because that was one of the conditions that Michael Cullen put on himself before he went ahead with those cuts. None of that has been acknowledged in the last 3 days. Now, we didn't need a lot of acknowledgement, but it is interesting, isn't it, that they are, even though they're so well ahead in the polls, that the National Party are feeling so graceless that they wouldn't even acknowledge that some things... They said the opposite. They said that they were wasted opportunities. They said that the Labor Party had blown the economy to bits. They have said all sorts of things. They've made a series of assertions with statistics that are simply wrong. And I mean, it's just in the nature of a debate. Who cares? But it is interesting that over 3 days, there was that level of gracelessness, and that the nice remarks were limited to Happy New Year and so on. Well, let me just say, I've got only a couple of minutes left, that the other things that struck me about the Prime Minister's speech and the leadership that he gave the rest of his caucus was what he didn't talk about. He didn't talk about the rich-poor gap. He didn't talk about the underclass, the existence of poverty, or social justice or social policy at all. There was a couple of bits and pieces about how they wanted to be a little bit harsher on beneficiaries and blame them for sort of classic National Party stuff. But when Phil Goff stood up at the beginning of the debate and said, how is it that Mr Key has a $1,000 a week tax cut advantage and yet the minimum wage went up by 25 cents an hour, nobody over those 3 days set up a defence for that. No one. And that was interesting. And the other thing that was interesting is that Mr Key nor anyone else in the National Party, not Mr Key nor anyone else in the National Party, over 3 days mentioned the environment. The Greens mentioned hardly anything else. Good for them. And we did from time to time. They did not at all. And the Prime Minister's speech is supposed to be broad-ranging. So I think, Mr. King,
Sorry to interrupt the member.
being a Prime Minister has just
time has expired.